The wind in Greywood never forgets. It moves like a whisper through the bare branches, humming old lullabies no mother remembers teaching. Beneath its sighs lie stories the townspeople no longer speak aloud, especially the one about the twins, the Merrick twins. Born under strange skies, raised behind drawn curtains, they were always seen, never heard. Not because they were quiet, but because they never needed to speak. It was in 1975, 30 years after the event everyone tried to erase, that Elijah Moore returned to his hometown. He hadn't planned to stay long, just long enough to clear out his grandmother's house after her sudden death. But then he found the journal. Dust-coated and leather-bound, it sat buried beneath loose attic floorboards, as if hiding from time itself. Elijah hadn't expected much, perhaps old recipes or melancholic recollections of family holidays. Instead, the first words he read chilled him. They never said a word, but they knew everything. There was no name on the cover, no signature at the end of any entry. Only dates and erratic, frantic handwriting, each line growing more unstable than the last. The journal spoke of twins with eyes too old for their age, who mirrored each other's movements so perfectly it seemed choreographed. It detailed moments of inexplicable knowledge, predictions that came true, injuries that were shared between two bodies. Beneath one particularly unsettling passage was a drawing. Two children, hand in hand, wide eyes, featureless mouths, and shadows that extended far beyond their feet, stretching into figures that barely resembled human form. Elijah's hands trembled as he turned the page, and there, etched in faint graphite beneath a smear of what looked like dried blood, was a phrase, "The Silent Ones." The end began with them. He didn't sleep that night. Memories he hadn't recalled in years clawed their way back, the creaking of floorboards when no one else was home, the day his dog ran whimpering from the woods, its fur singed as if struck by lightning, the dreams, twins standing at the edge of his bed, motionless, watching. Before we go deeper into what Elijah found, and what he uncovered that should have stayed buried, make sure to subscribe. There are stories like this hidden in forgotten corners, and we're just beginning to open the doors. The next morning, Elijah walked the streets of Greywood, now older, quieter but still bearing the weight of its secrets. The general store was run by the same woman who had sold him licorice as a boy. She remembered his grandmother with a bitter smile, but clammed up the moment he mentioned the Merricks. "No one talks about that family," she said flatly, eyes flicking to the empty shelves. "Best you let sleeping ghosts lie." At the town's modest library, buried beneath decades of high school yearbooks and pamphlets about maple syrup festivals, he found a single clipped newspaper article from 1945. No headline, just a yellowing page with the following lines, "Local tragedy strikes again." The Merrick family remains isolated after the unexplained disappearance of the father, Walter Merrick. Children remain under mother's care. No comment from authorities. The article was dated July 3rd, 1945. Something cracked open inside Elijah. He had been born in 1950, long after the events had supposedly ended. Yet he remembered a name, Merrick, spoken in hushed tones by older relatives. His grandmother had once scolded him for wandering too close to Greystone Hill, said the wind there carried voices that weren't prayers. Now, as he stood in the attic again, journal spread before him, Elijah noticed a loose panel behind an old trunk. Pulling it away revealed a crawl space thick with cobwebs and dust. Inside was a box wrapped in a tattered wool shawl. Inside the box, photographs. The images were faded, their edges curled with age. But the twins were unmistakable, pale, identical with dark hair, and eyes too focused for childhood. In every photo they stood still, never smiling, and always together. In one, they sat beside a woman, Clara Merrick, Elijah assumed. Her eyes were hollow, mouth stern, one hand on each child's shoulder. Another image showed the children standing in front of a mirror, yet in the reflection, their mouths were wide open, screaming. That was the moment Elijah knew. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't a story whispered to frightened children. This was real, and he had just opened the first page. What had begun as grief over his grandmother's death now spiraled into something deeper, darker. He would write a book. He would collect testimonies, records, anything he could find. because someone had to tell the truth about the Merrick twins. They spoke without words. But their story was loud, aching, eerie, and unfinished. In the summer of 1945, Greywood was a town just like any other, or at least it pretended to be. Tucked between the thick forests of Vermont and the misty ridges that shadowed it year-round, it held onto its traditions with tight fists, farming families, one church, 2 bars, and secrets no one admitted aloud. The Merrick family lived on the edge of town, where the trees grew dense and the dirt roads narrowed into silence. Their home, a tall and weathered Victorian, sat half buried in ivy like the forest was trying to reclaim it. Clara Merrick rarely came into town. When she did, people crossed the street. Not because she was cruel, because her eyes didn't blink often enough. Walter Merrick had once been a school teacher, respected, thoughtful, soft-spoken. But by the spring of 45, he had withdrawn from public life entirely. Some said he had been injured in the war. Others whispered about a nervous breakdown. No one ever asked him directly. The twins were born on June 13th during a storm that split the sky with green lightning. There was no doctor present, only a midwife named Elsie Turner, who never delivered another child after that night. She didn't talk about what she'd seen. When asked, she would only mutter, "They didn't cry, not once." Their names were Evelyn and Edgar, pale with thick black hair and identical birthmarks behind each ear, like crescents. From the moment they entered the world, they were off. Not sick, not slow, just not quite right. They didn't cry when hungry. They didn't scream when jabbed with needles. But their eyes were always open, always watching. They clutched each other's hands in perfect sync, as if they'd made a silent agreement long before birth. Never let go. By the time they were toddlers, the town had already assigned them a title, the Quiet Ones. Clara took pride in their silence. "They don't waste breath on nonsense," she'd say. "They understand more than we ever could." She dressed them in matching clothes, fed them the same meals, and kept a strict routine that no one was allowed to question. When Walter tried to separate them once, just for an hour, they screamed without sound. Their mouths never opened, but the windows cracked. Dr. Wexler, the town's only physician, examined the twins when they were 4. He ran hearing tests, speech tests, neurological assessments, all normal. Physiologically, he concluded, there's nothing wrong, but they respond to no verbal cues, no startle reflex to noise, no spoken communication whatsoever. And yet, they understood each other perfectly. One day, Clara brought them to the post office. A long line had formed. A toddler near the front was crying, clutching his knee after a fall. Evelyn stared at him for a moment, then touched her own knee and began to tear up, still without a sound. Moments later, the boy stopped crying. He looked at her in confusion, then smiled. Those who witnessed the moment didn't forget it. Strange things happened around the Merrick home. Lanterns flickered without wind. Birds refused to nest in the trees nearby. Dogs whined when passing their gate, tails tucked, ears flat. Still, the family never complained. Clara wrote in notebooks. Walter tended the garden, and the twins played quietly in the yard, mirroring each other's movements like reflections. At school, they sat side by side. The teacher, Miss Hanover, was kind, but even she struggled. "They never disrupt," she wrote in a report, "but they answer questions before I ask them. They stare so intently I forget what I'm saying." Other children avoided them. Rumors spread. One claimed Evelyn could make your nose bleed by looking at you. Another swore Edgar turned a frog inside out by clapping once. The teachers dismissed it as childhood fantasy. But parents started pulling their kids from class. Clara, undeterred, pulled them from school and began teaching them at home. She said the outside world was too slow, too loud, too full of distractions. She believed her children were gifted. Not just academically, spiritually. Walter disagreed, but he rarely spoke up. He spent more time in the barn, sometimes not returning until dawn. Neighbors began to hear shouting late at night. Then one evening the shouting stopped, and it never resumed. Clara told anyone who asked that her husband was simply unwell. "He needs rest," she said with a smile too wide. "We're giving him space." No one ever saw him again. As the weeks passed, the twins grew more synchronized, their actions eerily precise. They moved together, blinked together, sometimes even bled together. If Evelyn scraped her hand, a matching red line would appear on Edgar's. They didn't flinch, they didn't explain. They just watched. The Merrick home became a thing of legend. Children dared each other to touch the gate. No one ever made it past the second step. Some swore they saw faces in the windows, twice over, always the same, always watching. As the months passed, the town of Greywood stopped pretending the Merrick twins were normal. Even the most rational among them began to sense that something was wrong, something deeper than strangeness, something beyond what the mind could comfortably explain. Evelyn and Edgar moved like dancers performing an endless duet, their steps flawless, their timing uncanny. If Evelyn turned her head, Edgar followed, always at the same angle, as if tethered by invisible strings. When one coughed, the other blinked. When one fell, the other winced. It wasn't mimicry, it was connection. By their 6th birthday, they had never spoken a word, yet their bond grew sharper, more complex. They began to react not just to each other, but to the world in ways no one could understand. They would sit silently on the porch, staring at people walking by, and suddenly those people would drop keys, spill drinks, or forget where they were going. At first, it seemed like coincidence, but coincidences don't repeat every day. Clara wrote everything down. Every movement, every reaction, every strange occurrence. Her notebooks filled with symbols she claimed came to her in dreams. She rarely slept, often seen pacing at night through the upstairs window, the twins watching from behind her like quiet sentinels. At school, Evelyn once scribbled something in charcoal during recess. A shape, circular, fragmented, geometric, but imperfect. That night, a power outage swept across town. The next morning, the shape appeared again, drawn into the frost of a dozen car windshields. People started avoiding them more aggressively. Some locked their doors during the day. Others refused to speak to Clara at all. The twins seemed unbothered by it. If anything, they seemed to grow stronger the more they were left alone. Then came the pain sharing. It started when Edgar accidentally cut his palm on a piece of broken glass. Evelyn gasped and dropped her toy. A moment later, the exact cut appeared on her hand. Same depth, same curve. They both stared at the matching wounds, expressionless as if they expected it. Clara wept that night, but not out of fear, out of awe. "I don't understand it," she wrote in her journal. "But I know it's right. They're not broken, they're beyond us." Soon after, a strange incident rattled the community. A classmate, Tommy Reed, cornered Evelyn on the path home from school. Witnesses claimed he pulled her hair and shouted insults. Edgar, who had been 20 yards away with Clara, suddenly screamed, a shrill, inhuman sound that echoed across the fields. Tommy stumbled back and began convulsing. No one could explain it. No one dared to. But when he finally calmed, he remembered nothing, except for Evelyn's eyes, calm, unblinking, and unmoved. Tommy's mother pulled him from school. Within days, 3 other families did the same. Clara didn't protest. She simply withdrew further into the house. She stopped attending church, stopped answering the door. Her letters to the town council, cryptic, rambling, filled with theological musings, were quietly ignored. Meanwhile, Walter, once a ghostly presence in the background, became a shadow altogether. Clara told anyone who asked that he was still at home, resting. But no one saw him, not even at the feed store where he once shopped. The yard grew wild, the roof sagged. Yet the children remained perfectly groomed, dressed in pristine, matching clothes every day. Then came the predictions. At first, they were subtle. Evelyn would gesture toward the sky, and minutes later, thunder would rumble. Edgar once tapped 3 times on a table at the diner. 3 minutes later, the front window shattered from a bird strike, something that hadn't happened in decades. But the most chilling moment came during a birthday party at a neighbor's house. The twins stood by the fence, not invited but watching quietly. Evelyn picked up a rock and drew a jagged line in the dirt. 10 minutes later, a tree branch snapped in the yard, slicing the birthday cake in half. Clara called it alignment. She believed the children were harmonizing with something greater, something unseen. In her journals she wrote, They are not creating events. They are feeling them, pulling from a thread the rest of us don't know exists. But others believe something darker, that the children weren't just connected to the world, they were manipulating it. One morning, a local farmer found all 6 of his cows huddled against the far end of their pen, shivering and bleeding from the ears. He claimed he saw the twins on the hill the night before, standing motionless in the moonlight. No one could prove it. But after that, rumors took root like weeds, and Clara, she smiled through it all, as if she'd known this would happen, as if she welcomed it. By the fall of 1946, fear had taken root in Greywood like rot beneath floorboards. People didn't say the Merrick twins' names anymore, not out of spite, but superstition. To speak of them was to invite something cold and unknowable into your thoughts. And the children, now 7, seemed to sense it. More and more their presence preceded misfortune. At the town's annual harvest gathering, the pastor's daughter fell ill within minutes of returning home. A healthy child, suddenly burning with fever, mumbling incoherently about the shadows that move when you don't. Her father, Pastor Joseph Crane, was not a man easily rattled, but after that night he took to keeping a crucifix in every room of the church. And when asked what he thought of the Merrick children, he replied only, "Unnatural spirits dwell in that house." The sentiment spread fast. Greywood had always been a God-fearing town, but now fear outweighed faith. The children's abilities, or afflictions, depending on whom you asked, grew more erratic. Objects began to move without cause when they were near. Schoolhouse chalk shattered mid-lesson, books toppled off shelves, chairs slid silently across the floor, and when either twin became visibly upset, the air thickened as if saturated with tension too great for the room. Then came the accident. A dog from the neighboring farm, a docile old retriever named Patch, wandered onto the Merrick property. Clara saw it first and called out gently. Evelyn stood watching as the dog approached, tail wagging. But the moment Edgar stepped onto the porch, the animal froze, stiffened, then collapsed. No signs of injury, no bite marks, just dead. The vet couldn't explain it. Clara buried the dog herself. She left flowers at the neighbor's doorstep with a note. He was too kind for this world. Soon after, the Merricks stopped receiving mail. Local children began hanging small crucifixes and bundles of dried sage near the edges of their own properties, and for the first time in generations, someone defaced the church. Scratched into the wood near the altar, barely legible, "Protect us from the children." Walter, whose absence was now a certainty rather than a question, had not been seen in almost a year. Clara maintained he was simply on retreat, but even those who wanted to believe her couldn't anymore. She looked thinner, tired, yet her eyes were sharper, almost feverishly focused. She spoke in whispers even when no one was near. One day she arrived at the general store. She looked through the shelves as if they were foreign. When the storekeeper asked if she needed help, Clara turned and smiled. "They've started hearing it," she said softly. "Hearing what?" the woman asked. "The hum." The storekeeper said nothing. Clara left without buying anything. That winter, Evelyn and Edgar began to manipulate small things deliberately. Drops of water paused mid-air before hitting the ground. Leaves floated upward. A tin soldier toy hovered above Edgar's hand before snapping in half. Clara documented everything obsessively. Her journals became filled with diagrams and passages written in a language no one recognized, curving symbols and rhythmic patterns that didn't resemble any known script. By then, most townsfolk believed Clara was mad. Then one night, a boy named Luke wandered too close to the Merrick house on a dare. He was found hours later on the edge of Greystone Hill, eyes wide, shivering uncontrollably. His voice had vanished, and with it, every memory of what happened. He never spoke again. He didn't need to. Greywood demanded action. A town meeting was held in the church, attended by nearly every resident still brave enough to admit concern. Pastor Crane stood at the pulpit and delivered a sermon wrapped in warnings. "We must reclaim the peace this town once knew," he urged. "Those children are not of our world. If we let them remain, we invite darkness into our homes." Several nodded. Some wept. And a few proposed what others dared not say aloud, that the children be taken from Clara and placed in state care, or failing that, cast out of Greywood altogether. The next day, Clara received an unsigned letter at her door. "You have 1 week. Leave, or we come for them." She didn't tell the children, but she boarded the windows that same night. Inside the house, Evelyn and Edgar sat at opposite ends of the room, not touching, not speaking. Yet their eyes met. A flicker passed between them. Understanding. Unity. Later that week, the town awoke to the church bell ringing wildly in the dead of night. No one had pulled the rope, no wind had stirred, and carved into the bell itself, newly and without tool marks, was a single word: no. That was the moment Greywood stopped pretending. Elijah Moore couldn't stop thinking about the journal. Back in 1975, 30 years after Greywood had turned its back on the Merrick family, the words scrawled across those brittle pages still echoed through his mind. Something about the tone, part devotion, part desperation, had rooted itself inside him. He needed answers. The town had changed since he was a boy. The streets were quieter, older, and many of the houses abandoned. But when he asked about the Merricks, people still recoiled, not in anger but dread. At the library, he requested access to archived newspapers from the 1940s. The attendant hesitated, then pointed him to a rusting filing cabinet. Inside, Elijah found a handful of brief articles, fragments of a much larger, unspoken story. One mentioned Walter Merrick's disappearance in vague terms. Family matter, no foul play suspected. Another referred to continued unrest near the outskirts, but offered no details. The last simply read, "Greywood votes to isolate." There were no follow-ups, no conclusions, no obituaries. It was like someone had scrubbed the record clean. Determined, Elijah visited the old Merrick property. The house had long been abandoned, swallowed by creeping ivy and twisted trees. But it was still there, still watching. The porch groaned under his weight. The front door resisted at first, then gave way with a sigh like it had been holding its breath for decades. Inside, time had stopped. Dust coated every surface. Chairs sat undisturbed around a cracked dining table. Shelves sagged with books swollen from moisture. And yet the silence was dense, not peaceful, charged. Elijah moved carefully, flashlight sweeping across faded wallpaper and shattered picture frames. He reached the staircase when a sudden pressure pulsed through the air. His ears rang, the flashlight flickered. Then he heard it. A faint, low hum. Not mechanical, not human. It vibrated through the floorboards, like something alive and patient was resting beneath the house. He continued to the second floor. Most of the bedrooms had caved ceilings or mold-covered furniture, but one room was different. Pristine, untouched. The twins' room. 2 small beds sat side by side. Identical frames, identical quilts. A small wooden table between them, with 2 dolls facing each other. On the far wall, a mirror cracked vertically. Elijah stood before it, unsure why his breath caught. Then he noticed it, etched into the mirror's frame, hidden beneath grime. "We are never apart." He stepped back. Later, while exploring the attic again at his grandmother's house, Elijah stumbled on another discovery. Beneath a false wall panel, he found a crate of old letters, none addressed to his grandmother. They were all signed CM and bundled together by date. The letters weren't sent, they were confessions. In one, Clara wrote, "I see them in dreams that are not mine. Their mouths do not move, yet I hear them still. What they know, what they carry, it does not belong in this world." Another ended simply, "Walter tried to take them. Now the house has taken him." But it was the last letter that shook Elijah. "Elijah, if you find this, they're not gone. Time bends around them. Be careful. Some doors close in only one direction." How did Clara know his name? He hadn't even been born when she vanished. Unable to let it go, Elijah returned to the Merrick house one final time. This time, he brought tools. He pried loose the floorboards in the hallway and found a narrow staircase leading into the basement, a space no blueprint had ever mentioned. The air below was thick, stale, and colder than any Vermont winter. The basement was unfinished, its walls carved unevenly into stone. At the far end stood a door, no handle, no lock, just a slab of iron fitted into stone. And in front of it, a symbol drawn in faded red. A circle intersected by jagged lines, nearly identical to one he'd seen in Clara's journal. He didn't touch it. Instead, he turned back, heart racing, and stumbled into what looked like a sealed storage room. The contents were unlike anything else in the house. Ritual markings, piles of notebooks, sketches of the twins with eyes blacked out. A single page lay on the floor, out of place. On it, the same childlike drawing from the journal. The twins, side by side, hands clasped. But this time, there was a third figure behind them, featureless, enormous, and reaching. And beneath it, the silent ones listened to something else now. That night, Elijah had his first dream. The same one he would have for the rest of his life. Two children staring up at him, silent, waiting, not threatening but expecting. By the early months of 1947, Walter Merrick had become a ghost in every sense of the word. No one saw him. No one heard from him. And though Clara insisted he remained in the house, those closest to the property began to wonder whether he was alive at all. Some said he had fled. Others whispered darker things, that the house itself had consumed him. The truth, as always in Greywood, hung somewhere between silence and supposition. Clara's behavior grew stranger. She was no longer merely reclusive, she was obsessive. Her journals, once filled with curious observations, transformed into chaotic declarations. Scribbled lines blurred together in ink-smudged fury. Symbols that resembled language but resisted comprehension covered entire pages. Neighbors occasionally saw her at odd hours, pacing the yard barefoot, murmuring softly to herself, arms stretched to the sky. One farmer claimed he heard her humming a tune no one recognized, low, rhythmic, and mournful. Inside the house, Evelyn and Edgar became quieter still, if such a thing were possible. They no longer ventured outside. They no longer interacted with others at all. Their world had narrowed to a single structure, and within it, they thrived. Clara believed she was chosen. Her notes shifted in tone, laced with reverence. They're not broken. They are whole. More whole than the rest of us. They were born already listening. She described moments when the twins would sit motionless for hours, eyes glazed, faces expressionless. And yet, she wrote, they are more awake in those moments than any human ever has been. On one occasion, she described Edgar weeping without tears. He stared at the fireplace for hours, hands twitching rhythmically. Evelyn sat across from him, unmoving. When Clara approached, both turned toward her simultaneously, their heads tilting in perfect unison. "We're not alone," Evelyn said, her first word, ever. Clara collapsed, weeping. She considered it a sign, proof that their silence had not been a curse, but preparation, a chrysalis before the emergence. Soon after, the house changed. Rooms grew colder despite the fire burning all night. The mirrors stopped reflecting accurately. Images lagged or appeared warped. Clara covered most of them. At night, soft knocking echoed from inside the walls, but no one was ever found on the other side. And then came the silence. Walter, who had already been presumed missing, was finally confirmed gone when a state official arrived for a welfare check. Clara met him at the door. Her dress was stained with ink, her hands shaking. "He doesn't speak anymore," she whispered. "They took his voice." The man entered only briefly. What he saw made him resign 2 weeks later. He never spoke publicly about it. Clara, meanwhile, embraced what had come. She stopped trying to fix the children and began following their lead. The twins began painting symbols on the walls in ash and crushed berries. They arranged stones in patterns on the floor. They sat in opposite corners of rooms, staring at nothing for hours. And always, they remained in sync. On a cold March morning, Evelyn found a dead robin on the windowsill, its neck twisted, feathers damp. She reached out, gently cupping it in her hands. Edgar placed his hand over hers. The bird twitched, once, then again. For 3 full seconds, it moved. Then it died once more. Clara called it proof of communion. She believed the twins were no longer bound by the laws of life and death. She believed they had begun to understand how to bend the world around them. Not sorcery, she wrote, not miracle, alignment. Harmony with a frequency the rest of us cannot hear. But others saw something else. Despair. Walter's sister, a woman named Grace, attempted to intervene. She arrived unannounced, demanding to see the children. Clara refused, they argued. Later that night, townsfolk saw Grace sprinting barefoot down the road, her shoes left behind at the Merrick porch. She refused to speak of what happened. But her hands trembled for weeks after, and she left town soon thereafter. Within the house, the twins painted the walls darker colors: black, deep crimson, soot-stained gray. They removed light bulbs. At night, Clara watched them draw maps of places she didn't recognize, shapes like stars but wrong, twisted, bending. She began to dream of vast, empty landscapes, black skies, still waters that stretched endlessly, and 2 small figures always waiting at the edge. Then one night she found her own handwriting on a wall she swore she'd never touched. It read, "They no longer need us. They listen to something else now." She stared at the words for a long time. Then she smiled, a small, defeated smile, and left the door to their room open for the first time in months. Not as an invitation, as surrender. By late spring of 1947, the people of Greywood had passed the point of quiet worry. Now they were afraid in the open. The whispers in church halls became open discussion. The town council no longer debated whether something was wrong, they debated what to do about it. The name Merrick carried weight like a curse. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk near Greystone Road. School lessons skipped over any story involving unusual children. Even mail carriers refused to approach the house, opting instead to leave parcels at the bottom of the drive. And then, one night, the townsfolk acted. A group of men, 8 in total, marched to the Merrick home. None of them admitted afterward what they intended. Some carried lanterns, others ropes. One had a shotgun. They told themselves it was a warning, a message. But everyone knew what it really was. A reckoning. They reached the gate just past midnight. Inside, the house was quiet. No light, no movement. The wind had died. As they stepped through the threshold, one of the men, Thomas Weller, screamed and dropped his lantern. The flame didn't spread, but the sound echoed for minutes. He had seen something in the upper window, he claimed later. Not a child, not Clara. Something tall, thin, watching. The rest dismissed it and pressed forward. They pounded on the door. No answer. Then, all at once, every window on the ground floor shattered inward, not outward, from the inside as if expelled by force. Glass exploded into the men's faces. 2 of them were blinded. The group scattered. The shotgun was never fired. Clara didn't file a report. The next morning, she was seen sweeping shards of glass from the porch, humming to herself. Evelyn and Edgar stood behind her, eyes open, still as stone, their expressions unreadable. One neighbor swore they were smiling. After that, everything changed. The town no longer tried to confront the Merricks, but they didn't forget. Instead, they retaliated quietly. Children from the school painted red X on the Merrick mailbox. A crude cross was nailed to a tree across the road. Someone smeared salt across their gate, an old folk ritual no one had used in years. Others hung mirrors facing their own windows, turned outward to reflect the evil. Then came the fire. Someone, no one ever confessed, lit the Merrick chicken coop ablaze in the middle of the night. It was a desperate act, perhaps intended to scare them, perhaps to punish. But the flames didn't spread, not to the trees, not to the house. When firemen arrived, they found something they couldn't explain. Inside the charred remains of the coop were the chickens, unburnt, whole, lying in a perfect circle, eyes open, necks twisted, no sign of smoke in their lungs. The event became known as the Still Fire. Afterward, Clara stopped leaving the house altogether. From then on, the twins were only ever seen in glimpses, shadows at the edge of curtains, silhouettes on the landing. They didn't move like children. They didn't watch like children. And then Evelyn and Edgar stopped sleeping. At least, not in the human sense. According to Clara's journal, they no longer required it. They sat for hours on end in perfect stillness, only blinking when she left the room. She tried speaking to them, coaxing them back to stories and lullabies. They no longer responded. They had entered some kind of trance together. Clara wrote, "They hum in perfect silence now, I cannot hear it. But I feel it in my chest." One night she found the twins in the attic. They had pushed aside all furniture, forming a ring of rocks, nails, and bird bones. In the center, they sat back to back, eyes rolled upward, hands trembling. She didn't interrupt. Over the following days, people in town began to experience strange symptoms: headaches, nausea, static in their radios, dead clocks. Animals fled. Birds stopped nesting. Cattle refused to eat. A young woman, Sarah Beale, claimed she heard a voice outside her window every night, whispering things she couldn't understand. When she finally opened the curtain, she collapsed screaming and never spoke again. She spent the rest of her life in an asylum, drawing spiral shapes in chalk. The tipping point came when a young boy named Micah wandered too close to the Merrick fence. His parents found him standing perfectly still, hands at his sides, eyes blank. When they finally got him to move, he walked back to their house without speaking. Later that night, he wet the bed for the first time in years and whispered, "They told me it's almost time." When asked who they were, he simply stared. That week, the town held its final council meeting. For the first time, no one opposed the resolution. The Merrick family would be forcibly relocated. The council sent word through official channels. Arrangements were made for a government agent to intervene. Clara, unaware, continued her recordings. And the twins? They waited in the attic, drawing new shapes. The relocation order arrived on the morning of June the 2nd, 1947. It came stamped with a government seal and signed by an official Elijah would later find no records of. The letter was formal, brief, and final. The Merrick family would be moved for the safety of themselves and the greater community. No reason was given beyond that. 3 days later, just before dawn, a black car pulled into Greywood. No one greeted it. No one dared step outside. Clara, ever watchful, must have seen the car before the knock came. When the agent arrived at her door, she opened it without hesitation. Her hair was tied back. Her dress was clean. Her eyes, however, betrayed exhaustion. "I knew this day would come," she said calmly. "But you're late." There was no resistance, no shouting. She gathered a single suitcase, motioned for the twins to follow, and left the house without looking back. Evelyn and Edgar moved like shadows behind her, still mirroring each other perfectly. The car didn't head toward the town. It took a side road, one few locals used, leading to a small, secluded cottage deep in the woods near Greystone Hill. It had once belonged to an old trapper, long abandoned and nearly forgotten. The Merricks were left there without explanation. The agent left and never returned. Greywood exhaled, quietly, nervously, but with a sense of relief. The house stood empty. The whispers subsided. It was as if the town itself sighed through its windows, but peace would not last. On the night of June 9th, a storm rolled in, slow at first, then violent. Thunder boomed with unnatural rhythm. The sky flashed green, just as it had on the night the twins were born. Trees bent as if bowing. The wind screamed not in gusts but pulses, like a message being sent in a language no one could understand. At exactly 2:14 a.m., lights were seen above the woods near Greystone Hill, soft at first, then blinding. A deep, vibrating hum filled the air. Windows shook in their frames. Dogs barked and howled before falling silent. Radios crackled to life with no signal. Clocks stopped ticking. Then came the screams. Dozens of residents later reported hearing them, long, layered, distorted, like voices being pulled through water. Some swore they saw shadowy figures walking across the treetops. Others claimed their dreams twisted that night into nightmares they couldn't wake from. One family, the Hartmans, lived closest to the forest line. Their eldest daughter, just 16, vanished that night. No sign of forced entry. No footprints, no sound. Only her open bedroom window and the words, "They're almost done," scrawled on the wall in charcoal. The next morning, Greywood was still. Police were dispatched to the Merrick's new residence. What they found defied reason. The house was intact, the door unlocked, the furniture untouched. But Clara was gone. Her suitcase remained untouched on the floor. Her journal sat on the table, open to a blank page. 2 teacups were placed beside it, one tipped, one full. The twins, however, were there, seated calmly on the living room floor, hand in hand, their clothes spotless, their hair neatly combed, their eyes wide and utterly still. They didn't speak. They didn't move. Paramedics were called, but found no injuries, no sign of distress, no response to touch, voice, or light. When moved, they offered no resistance, but as soon as they were separated, their bodies tensed. The moment they were brought back together, their breathing steadied. Medical reports would later describe them as catatonic, yet synchronized. One doctor called it psychological mirroring of an unprecedented degree. Another simply wrote, "They're waiting for something." Clara's disappearance was never explained. No search party ever found a trace of her. Not her clothes, not her body, nothing. And the twins? They were placed into a private medical facility under state supervision. No charges were filed. No case was opened. The official story claimed post-traumatic shock as the diagnosis. But behind closed doors, the staff feared them. Nurses reported lights flickering whenever they entered the room. Machines malfunctioned. One orderly suffered a seizure after looking too long into Edgar's eyes. Another quit after Evelyn stood beside her bed in the middle of the night without opening a door. Security footage was recorded, then mysteriously corrupted. Eventually, the twins were transferred to a more secure wing, one that no one discussed. Back in Greywood, the house on Greystone Road decayed. The windows sagged, the paint peeled, and yet no birds landed on the roof. No vines grew on the siding. The earth itself seemed unwilling to touch what remained. Children told stories about the Merricks in hushed tones. They said the twins had been taken by something not of this world, that Clara had offered herself willingly, that the lights were still there, hidden deep in the forest, waiting. And once a year, on the night of June 9th, the sky above Greywood flickers green, just for a moment. Elijah returned to the Merrick house a third time, this time with more resolve than fear. The unanswered questions had grown too loud. Clara's journal hinted at something beneath the surface, something literally buried. And after weeks of sifting through town records, medical reports, and cryptic letters, he believed he'd found a clue. A single mention of a sealed basement room in an early blueprint, one that never appeared again in later renovations. He brought tools, flashlight, crowbar, gloves. The house groaned as he stepped inside, as though annoyed to be disturbed again. Dust hung thick in the air. The staircase creaked under his weight, each step a question. He reached the kitchen, then moved aside a shelf that didn't quite match the others. Behind it was a warped panel, slightly bowed in the middle. He pressed, and the wood gave way with a sigh. A hidden door revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air was colder, not just in temperature, but in mood. It pressed against his skin like damp cloth, full of something watching. At the bottom, the room opened into a cramped chamber of stone and dirt, half-finished and unearthed by hand. The walls were lined with old boards, some inscribed with markings he didn't recognize. Not language, not decoration, more like memory etched in wood. In the far corner, he found it, the sealed room. It looked like an old pantry door, but thicker, reinforced from the outside with iron brackets. No handle, no hinges. Only a vertical slit carved into the center, barely wide enough for a finger. Around it, more of those markings, drawn in charcoal, soot, and something darker. Next to the door lay a small wooden crate, long rotted through but still intact. Inside were brittle papers, yellowed and torn. Elijah carefully unfolded them. They were sketches, dozens of them. He recognized the faces immediately, the twins, Edgar and Evelyn, drawn from every angle. Their eyes always wide, always too large, their expressions eerily consistent. But what unsettled him most wasn't the children, it was the third figure. In almost every sketch, A tall presence loomed behind them. It lacked a face, lacked limbs even, but had a defined shape, arching like a shadow peeled from time. Its head bent low, as if whispering into their minds. The oldest sketch had a date, August 1946. The final one bore no date, only one phrase scribbled across the bottom in Clara's frantic hand. "They are the door." Elijah stood frozen. His breath quickened. He backed away from the sealed room and turned toward the crate stacked near the wall. One had clearly been opened and re-nailed hastily. He pried it open, expecting more drawings. Instead, he found something far worse. Audio tapes, 5 reels. Unlabeled except for short notes in Clara's handwriting. Day 41, voice returns. Unseen movement. They call me now. Final entry. He took them all. Back in his grandmother's attic, he borrowed an old reel-to-reel machine and fed in the first tape. It crackled, hissed. Then Clara's voice. "I've kept this for myself. I don't know why. No one would believe it anyway." A pause. Then, "They speak now not with mouths but with silence so loud it shatters glass. I hear them in dreams. I see places I've never been. And last night, I saw Elijah." He stopped the tape. Heart racing, Elijah checked the reel again. No date. But her voice had aged. This wasn't from the 1940s. This was later, much later, long after she had supposedly vanished. The next tape shook him even harder. "It was never about what they were," Clara said more urgently. "It's about what they're becoming. The thing that stands behind them, feeds from them. It was drawn here, and now it's listening through them." Another pause, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. "I can't stop it, but maybe he can." He listened to the final tape last. Clara whispered, "Elijah, I know this will reach you." The drawings were only glimpses. The truth is, under the house, behind the door we never opened. Don't go alone. But he had already gone, and she had already seen him, decades before he'd set foot back in Greywood. Now he understood. Time did not move forward in this story. It folded, bent, echoed. The Merrick twins weren't just part of history. They were its hinge. And somewhere behind that sealed iron door was the axis on which their silence turned. Elijah wasn't the only one watching the Merrick case. As he dove deeper into the town's forgotten history, he came across a sealed envelope tucked inside a discarded town council ledger. No return address, no sender, just a single phrase written on the front, "For those still seeking." Inside were copies, faded, incomplete, of government documents marked "Confidential." The headers read, "Department of Unusual Phenomena, Field Division, Greywood Containment Site, File 48173M, Merrick Anomaly." He read every page with trembling hands. The first report, dated August 1947, described the relocation of the Merrick family as a response to persistent social disruption caused by unexplained behavioral phenomena. It wasn't local pressure that initiated it. It was surveillance. The federal government had been watching since 1946. According to the file, agents had been dispatched under the guise of census work. What they found disturbed them. Children exhibiting synchronized behavior unexplainable by environmental factors, apparent nonverbal cognition, documented incidents of parallel physical response, emotional contagion beyond conventional parameters. One note in the margins read, "Collective consciousness." The second file was a transcript. An agent named Richard M. Lansing had interviewed Clara shortly after the relocation. The audio was redacted, but the transcript remained. Agent: "Mrs. Merrick, do you believe your children are in danger?" Clara: "No, but the world is." Agent: "From them?" Clara: "From what listens through them." That phrase appeared again and again. What listens through them. The agents had tried to isolate the twins. They constructed an observation room, used two-way mirrors, introduced various stress stimuli to gauge reaction. But nothing worked. The children remained motionless until separated. Then came the incident. One report described it as psychokinetic feedback, resulting in structural failure. In truth, the room imploded. Glass, metal, concrete, pulled inward as if gravity had collapsed in reverse. 3 agents were hospitalized. One suffered a complete mental breakdown, repeating the same phrase over and over. It's not just them. It's behind them. After that, the operation changed tone. Orders came down from higher than the Department of Health, from places whose names weren't printed. The mission shifted from observation to containment. The children were never officially recorded again. Elijah turned to the next page and found a single handwritten memo, unsigned. Recommend immediate site quarantine, cease communication, house records under classified vault, terminate civilian access. They cannot be understood, they cannot be controlled. Only one course remains: silence. He sat in the dark, surrounded by papers that had no business surviving, trying to make sense of it all. And then he saw it. A photograph slipped between 2 reports. It showed a group of agents standing before the Merrick residence, a car in the background, a clipboard in hand. In the window behind them, barely visible, 2 faces, identical, watching. Their expressions were not fearful, not curious, just patient. Elijah knew in that moment what the files had refused to say out loud. The twins had not been forgotten. They had been hidden, not for protection, for containment. He returned to the Merrick house one final time, not to dig, not to investigate, just to stand, to feel. The air was thick with memory. He walked slowly, letting the creaks guide him. Then, once more, he descended to the basement. The sealed door was still there, unmoved, untouched, and yet different. There were new markings now, faint and curved like branches pressed into clay. He hadn't made them. No one had. But they were there. He stood before the slit in the door, unsure what he expected. He whispered Clara's name. He whispered the twins. Nothing responded. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something scrawled into the dust along the floorboards. Letters traced by a child's hand. You found it. He stepped back. No breeze. No movement. Just the quiet thrum of the earth beneath his feet. The same hum Clara had described. Elijah understood then what the government files refused to admit. The Merrick twins were not an anomaly. They were an opening. And someone, or something, had been waiting to step through. Greywood changed in subtle ways first. The birds stopped coming back. Radios filled with static, even when unplugged. Children woke up screaming about mirrors that whispered. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it, the weight of something building. Then the power failures began. Homes flickered in and out of light. Phone calls cut off mid-sentence. The air buzzed, not like electricity, but like something alive moving just beneath perception. It made teeth ache, eyes water, thoughts drift. On the night of September 3rd, Elijah was sitting in his grandmother's attic, reviewing the final tape again when the sound came. The hum, low, layered, familiar. It vibrated through the walls, through his bones. It wasn't from the tape. It was outside, everywhere. He stood, heart pounding, and stepped toward the window. They were there. Evelyn and Edgar. Standing at the edge of the yard, perfectly still, their hair unmoved by wind, their faces untouched by time. They hadn't aged, not a day. They were the same children from the photographs, expressionless, watching. He blinked, and they were gone. But the hum remained. The next morning the headlines didn't report anything strange, but those in town knew something had returned or never left. People began to speak of lost time, moments erased from memory, an entire morning spent staring at the wall, unsure why. A full meal cooked but not eaten, no memory of preparing it, names forgotten, familiar places that suddenly looked wrong. Elijah walked Greywood streets, looking for answers but found only more silence. Homes shuttered, eyes averted, a weight hanging over everything. At the edge of town, he visited the old hospital that once held the twins. It was abandoned now, rotting. Its front gate chained, its windows broken. Inside he found the medical wing where they had been kept. In the center of one room, scratched into the floor, was a spiral symbol, deep, exact, with burn marks around the edges. No tools nearby, no reason it should be there. He found no records, no files. But in a drawer beneath a broken cabinet, he discovered something chilling. A photograph dated 1952, the twins again, still children, still unchanged, but this time a man stood behind them. Elijah. He staggered back, dropped the photo. It didn't make sense. He wasn't born until 1950. But there he was, clear, present, standing with them, eyes closed, expression blank. His breathing shortened. The floor beneath him seemed to pulse. He fled the hospital. That night the hum returned, louder, and the dreams began again. He stood in the woods near Greystone Hill. The trees bent away from him, their branches twisted. The earth beneath his feet shimmered as if barely solid. Ahead, the twins waited, backlit by a pulsing light. They spoke this time, not with mouths, but directly into him. "You're almost ready." He woke screaming. In the following days, others in town reported seeing the children, always at the edge of vision, always just out of reach. Some said they followed them home. Others said they stood at their bedsides and never blinked. Technology began to fail outright. Radios stopped working. Watches spun out of sync. Entire conversations disappeared from tape recorders. And then, on September 7th at 2:14 a.m., every mirror in Greywood cracked, simultaneously, the same hour the lights had appeared 30 years before. Elijah, now certain his time was unraveling, returned to the sealed door beneath the Merrick house. He brought nothing, no notes, no camera, just himself. He stood before it and whispered, "I'm here." The hum stopped. The silence that followed was complete, not absence but containment. He turned to leave. In the mirror across the room, one he didn't remember being there, he saw the twins. Standing behind him, not moving, not smiling, waiting. Elijah awoke in a place that wasn't his room, nor the Merrick house, nor any place he remembered from waking life. The ground beneath him pulsed faintly, not like earth, but like breathing fabric. Above him stretched a sky that wasn't dark or light, but the shade between dream and memory. Soft, humming, endless. He was standing, though he didn't recall rising. Ahead the forest curved inward, trees twisted upward like vertebrae, their branches fused and bending toward a center that pulsed with faint green light. Every breath he took tasted like metal and moss. The twins stood in the clearing, Evelyn and Edgar, exactly as they had always been. They didn't move as he approached. They didn't blink. Behind them stood something else. It wasn't a figure, not truly. It had no shape he could describe, only an absence, a distortion in space that bent the forest around it. Wherever it moved, sound vanished. The wind recoiled. Elijah stopped a few paces from the children. "You brought me here," he said aloud. Neither answered, but something shifted in the air. A wave, not of noise but knowledge, washed over him. Images, impressions, places he'd never seen, cities built in silence, languages that moved through thought, creatures that lived in memory alone. Then he saw Clara, not as a woman, not in flesh, but as an echo, her voice layered over itself. "They don't belong to us," she whispered. "They never did. We were only the cradle." Time fractured. Elijah stood at the kitchen table in 1945, then again in 1975, then nowhere. He watched Walter break apart, not with violence, but with silence, consumed from the inside. He saw doctors looking into the twins' eyes and forgetting their own names. He saw Clara surrender herself not to death but to the truth that the children were not conduits, but catalysts. In a flash, Elijah was a child again, looking into a mirror that didn't reflect his body but someone else's, someone older, someone not him. The hum rose again, this time not just around him, but inside. He fell to his knees, hands clutching his head. Visions poured in faster now, civilization after civilization falling into silence, not because of destruction, but because of knowing. Once the truth was heard, there was no need to speak. Once the source was touched, everything else fell away. He saw the shape, that shape, reaching for the earth again and again through hosts, voices, eyes. And always, the twins were waiting. They weren't servants, they weren't vessels. They were the first true listeners, and now Elijah understood. They had chosen him, not to stop it, to complete it. He looked at his own hands, flickering, changing, younger then older. His skin became paper, then light, then memory. He opened his mouth to scream, but only silence came out. And it was beautiful. There was no time, not anymore, only sensation. Elijah existed, but not in the way he once did. He moved through memories not his own, drifting like smoke across moments in history that spanned far beyond his birth. He saw civilizations crumble, not with war, but with revelation. He heard thoughts before they were spoken, felt the weight of truths never meant to be known. He hovered above Greywood, not as a man, but as presence. Below, the Merrick twins walked through the forest, not aged, not changed, only constant. Around them, the earth trembled subtly, like it remembered them. Wherever they stepped, trees leaned inward. Moss curled in spirals. The wind followed. They did not look back. Elijah watched his past self standing in the attic holding Clara's journal. He saw his face when he read her final message. He felt again the thrum in his chest when the tape recorder first spoke his name. But now he knew. It had never been a warning. It was an invitation. He drifted backward into the hospital room, the one no longer standing. He saw the photographs burned into the walls, the twins, Clara, the third shape. In each frame, the being behind them grew clearer, less abstract, a spine of light. A crown of absence, arms not of bone or flesh, but thought. Then came the desert, not of sand, but of silence. He stood alone in an infinite plain where even memory faded. Above him, a sky like frozen ash. Ahead, two figures in white holding hands, the twins again. But this time he stepped forward, not as Elijah Moore, but as what he had become. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The children turned to him, and then knelt. Around them images bloomed like petals from the ground, visions of places beyond human language, realms without physics, consciousness without structure, a library that remembered every version of every life ever lived. And in that moment Elijah understood. The twins were not the end, they were the beginning. He saw his own death, not as tragedy, but as emergence. A final shedding of voice, body, boundary. A dissolving into awareness so vast it no longer needed form. He saw a version of himself writing the final page of a book in a room that no longer existed. He saw the title, The Silent Line, a study of the echo that waits. And then finally he stood at the edge of the great mirror. Not glass, not metal, a surface like memory. He looked into it, not his face, not the twins, but something older, something that had always been behind the silence. It looked at him, and it smiled. In October of 1975, Greywood ceased to exist, not through fire, not through flood, but through forgetting. The town emptied with eerie efficiency. The official story cited environmental instability, a sinkhole that opened near Greystone Hill, rendering the area unsafe for residents. The government sealed the roads, redirected maps, removed signage. But those who lived there knew better. They left because something had changed. The air itself hummed differently. Shadows lingered longer. Dreams bled into waking. People no longer trusted their own memories, and at night they saw reflections that moved on their own. A few tried to speak out. A local radio host recorded a segment about the children who never grew. The tape never aired. He was found days later in a motel, dazed, repeating the phrase, "They walked through me." The library's microfilm archive spontaneously combusted one afternoon, without flame, just heat and silence. What remained turned to dust on contact. Even Pastor Crane, once defiant, abandoned his church without warning. His final sermon, scribbled onto a torn page, read, "Some knowledge leaves a stain, and some silence is too loud to bear." As structures collapsed and roots overtook the streets, the Merrick house did not decay. It remained upright, untouched by moss, free from erosion. The land rejected everything else, but not it. Then, one morning, it was simply gone. No debris, no ruins, no foundation. Where it once stood was bare soil, untouched, undisturbed, like something had lifted it clean from the earth. Not long after, the Department of Unusual Phenomena closed the Greywood file. The final internal memo read, "No further investigation required. Site inactive. Subjects no longer traceable. Recommend full redaction." Digital records vanished, photographs discolored. Even aerial surveys from the 60s were overwritten, pixels scrambled where Greywood should have been, but not everything disappeared. One object survived, Elijah's manuscript. The Silent Line, a study of the echo that waits. Published posthumously in 1983, it was dismissed by most as speculative horror, but those who read it closely noticed things they couldn't explain, drawings that matched dreams, passages that seemed to shift upon rereading, a final chapter that ended mid-sentence, followed by blank pages that filled slowly with words over time. Some readers claimed they could hear humming after finishing it. Others found symbols drawn on their mirrors. The publisher went bankrupt within a year. The original typeset burned in a warehouse fire. Only a few copies remain. They pass quietly from hand to hand, unlisted in libraries, never sold in stores, and wherever one appears, strange things follow. A woman in Oregon reported seeing twin children at her window 2 nights after finding the book in a used shop. A man in Nova Scotia vanished, leaving behind only a journal repeating the phrase, "They remember me." And in a lab basement in New Jersey, a linguistics professor deciphered a passage of symbols and wept for 3 hours straight. He never spoke again. Elijah's presence remains debated. Some say he died in 1976. Others claim he's still writing, somewhere that time no longer holds. Those who believe speak of an echo consciousness, a lingering presence that touches minds prepared to listen. The twins are never mentioned by name, but everyone who encounters the silence knows. They are not gone. They never were. In 1997, a graduate researcher named Natalie Rowan stumbled upon Elijah Moore's manuscript in a locked cabinet at a university archive in Vermont. The cabinet had no key, no label. She opened it anyway. The book was cold to the touch. Its title had faded, but the first page bore a handwritten note. "If you found this, they've already found you." Natalie wasn't superstitious. She studied folklore and cultural memory. But as she read through the manuscript, she began to notice oddities. Words shifting, ink smearing only on certain pages. A humming she first blamed on faulty lights. Then the dreams began. At first shadows, then faces. 2 children, always identical, always watching. They never moved. They never spoke. But in the dreams, she understood them, not with words, through something deeper, something buried. She recorded her findings in a notebook. It included transcriptions of the symbols in the margins, drawings of the spiral patterns Elijah had described, and her own additions, entries written during sleepwalking episodes. One morning, she awoke to find the phrase, "We never left," etched into her bedroom wall. She wasn't afraid, she was ready. 2 weeks later, she vanished. Her notebook remained. It ends mid-sentence. Today, few speak of Greywood. It's not on most maps. The land where it stood is now protected federal property. Entry forbidden. Not due to danger. Officially, it's a wildlife restoration zone. Unofficially, it's watched. Drones lose signal overhead. Hikers hear voices in places where no paths remain. And once a year, on the anniversary of the first incident, strange lights bloom in the sky, green, silent, soft as breath. Those who know, stay away. Those who don't, feel drawn. The Merrick twins have become legend. A whisper, a riddle without a question. Some believe they were aliens, others vessels of a forgotten god. A few call them the start of something still unfolding. But no one denies this. They were real, and their silence never ended. Elijah's manuscript continues to circulate. No one knows how. It appears where it's needed. And always, those who read it report the same thing. They feel watched. They begin to hear the hum. And eventually they understand. Not all doors open forward. Some are circular, some are mirrors, and some are children. If you've made it this far, you've heard it too. You know now that this wasn't just a story. It was a return. So before you leave, subscribe, join the archive. There are more stories hidden like this one, waiting to be remembered. And if you feel something behind you now just outside your vision, don't look. Instead, click the video on screen to uncover the next case. Because the Merrick twins weren't the last, only the first.